So some of the change types and key concepts. I'm not a big fan of the way they've named these change types. They have improved the definitions somewhat in ITIL 2011, but still we're stuck with the change types of normal and standard, which sound very similar but are actually very different. A normal change follows the normal change process. I would say that the biggest difference between the two is that a normal change needs to go through the change advisory board, whereas a standard change is considered pre-authorized and may only need what we call local levels of authorization. So a standard change might be, for example, you have a new employee who needs to be onboarded, so maybe you just need the approval of the hiring manager, an HR manager, or somebody on the service desk. A normal change, however, might be change to the actual code of the ERP software that the organization is using, so that certainly would need to be reviewed, to be assessed, approved, and then finally scheduled to ensure that it will have a minimum of impact on the organization. Emergency changes go through the same process as normal changes. It's just the time frames have been compressed. So an emergency change is implemented to correct an issue or other type of serious problem within the infrastructure. Some of the key terms in change management include the CAB, or Change Advisory Board. There is also the concept of an ECAB, or an Emergency Change Advisory Board. These are the people who are providing their assessments and recommendations for the approval or rejection of a particular change. The change manager ultimately grants the final approval, but he or she should be taking input from the Change Advisory Board members. When we are developing our plan for change, we should certainly include backout or remediation plans to get us to as close of a previous state as possible. There are a few types of schedules that we want to maintain. We want to understand what our projected schedule of outages is, so we may want to understand what our availability windows are, for example, for various services. And then as we schedule our changes, we want to keep track of those on our calendar because we want to be sure that we're not conflicting with other changes that may be made within the infrastructure. A lot of times we get questions about, well, what should we be reviewing in a change advisory board meeting? And here's an example of a sample agenda. So it may be necessary to review problematic changes, or really to review all changes that have been made, including the wins or accomplishments. We sometimes refer to that as a post-mortem, where we looked at what lessons can we learn from the problems or issues that we've had. We also want to look at the requests for change. So RFC stands for request for change. We want to see those that have been assessed or that need to be assessed. If there are any RFCs coming down the pike that we should be made aware of, that should be discussed in the Change Advisory Board meeting. And also, if the change process itself needs to be revised or evaluated, that can be discussed at a CAB meeting. There are multiple phases to a change. So when the change is raised or at the initiation point, again, that can be initiated either by an end user, by somebody within IT. It could be initiated by a supplier. So the classic example is Microsoft alerts you that they have yet another service pack or patch or hotfix to apply to your operating system or other software. After the change has been initiated, there may need to be just a quick evaluation to determine, is this something that we want to spend time assessing? Is this practical? or feasible? If so, then we go through the full risk and impact analysis and assessment. We need to be sure to obtain appropriate levels of approval, and again, that will be dependent upon the scope of the change. We then need to implement the change, and often this will be handed off or kind of have an extension of change management into release and deployment management for the actual implementation. And then finally, once we have had a conclusion of the implementation, successful or not, we need to review the change. All right. I do have another question I want about change managers, so I want to be sure to address that in case anybody else has the same question. Very good question about the change advisory board. Is the CAB doing all of this or the change manager? So when, let me go back one. So certainly the CAB meeting is for all change advisory board members, so they should be providing assessments and evaluations as necessary. The change manager is really just the coordinator of these activities. So the change manager isn't necessarily doing all of these activities, him or herself. The change advisory board, they may assign assessments or evaluations based on subject matter areas. They may even pull in vendors or suppliers. So, I mean, I myself have even been part of a customer's, or actually multiple customers, change advisory board meetings where I come in and I provide recommendations or assessments or evaluation of specific changes that have been proposed. So the change manager lays out the agenda, but really depends upon the change advisory board members to provide their input for the various phases of the change. The change manager really just has responsibility for the approval. He or she should be assigning out the other tasks in the change phases as appropriate. So I hope that answered the question that came up. So I mentioned that the implementation of the change is typically handed off to release and deployment management. We also often see release and deployment management as kind of an afterthought to change management, but really especially for development teams, this is their primary focus. In release and deployment management, we have several components, and the most important of which are typically testing and training. So we want to test each of the components, starting off with the very basic components. We then continue to develop what we call our release package, and until we have a fully functioning system with our services that all should work seamlessly together. Just like with change management, there are a number of phases to release and deployment management. We need to create the plans, test the package, ensure that we have the ability to deliver the release. We want to make sure that we minimize the impact. And then the last one, which is kind of ambiguous, just verify satisfaction. I would say the biggest component to verifying satisfaction of a particular release would be the training aspect. Make sure that people are satisfied with it, they know how to use the new release, how it works with the other components and CIs and everything else that they are working with. Knowledge management is the fourth of these processes that we'll review. And again, knowledge management is something that is introduced in service transition, but that certainly extends well beyond the service transition phase. We can even start gathering knowledge as we are designing, or as we are in the service design phase of the life cycle. The concept here is that with increased context and understanding, we move beyond having just basic data. We move from having data to putting that together to develop information, which leads to knowledge and ultimately, hopefully, wisdom. So again, going back to that example, knowledge management is especially important when we talk about configuration management or ITSACM, where I mentioned the story of the technician or analyst who provided incorrect information because, or incorrect guidance because they didn't have the correct data regarding the configuration of the end user's components. So we want to make wise decisions and provide sound guidance to our end users, and we develop that through better knowledge. So as much as you can, it's important to gather information early and to continue to gather and make available the knowledge of the organization really as far down as you can. So even providing knowledge through some type of self-service or mid-tier interface so that you can extend the knowledge to the end users and even prevent requests from coming into the organization, which certainly does lower the overall cost of support. So those were the 4 processes in service transition, and I'll touch back on those in a few minutes, but I did want to also review the other phases of the life cycle that we had not yet covered. Most people are fairly familiar with service operation because it's this phase of the life cycle where the end user actually sees the value. This is where we are interacting with the end users. We are focused here on delivery and control processes. We also want to make sure that we are maintaining a steady state or kind of the day-to-day operations of the infrastructure. There are a number of processes that we introduce in service operation. One of the things that I teach in my classes is how to differentiate between, well, when is a particular occurrence considered an event, when is it an incident, when should it be classified as a problem, a request, or when does it fall under access management. So lots of depth and detail that we could go into there. But it's important that you do understand the differences and understand how those processes work together for solid service operation. Service operation is also the phase of the life cycle where we introduce the functions or functional areas. These individuals or teams work throughout the life cycle. These are our IT people, so they are not confined to the service operation phase. That again is simply where where the end user perceives the work being done by those functional areas and where they do most of their work. Mentioned that it's important to differentiate between the various processes and components in service operation, and I introduced this here because it does relate to change management. We talked about standard changes, and I gave the example of a new hire onboarding request. It's important to understand that standard changes have a tie to service operation and specifically to service requests. When you receive requests from your end users or customers, it's important to differentiate between what we call incidents and what we call service requests because they are not the same. Especially for your own reporting purposes, the time frames involved are going to be widely different. In incident management, I'm trying to fix something that has failed or there's been some degradation of service. So obviously I need to resolve that and fix it as quickly as possible. I want to restore service as quickly as possible.